This is George Galloway for Kalima Horra on الميادين television, coming to you from London. Coming to you from London. I'm George Galloway, presenting Kalima Horra, where every word is free. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on الميادين television. Nowadays, coming to you from London. We're talking tonight about the ISIS crisis, and I have assembled an audience of experts and some gifted amateurs like me. The ISIS crisis grows ever more grave. Just in the last few days, it spread to Libya, with the mass murder of 21 Egyptian Christians, Coptic people, who were ordinary workers, agricultural workers in Libya. ISIS in Libya lined them up along the Mediterranean coast on the beach, just yards from the waves, and cut their throats one by one after the other. Even by the standards of ISIS barbarianism, it was a pretty sordid spectacle. But it didn't shock people in the West quite as much as the mass murder of other hostages. Western hostages, Japanese hostages, they really commanded the front pages. Unfortunately, the Egyptian Christians did not, at least for long, which tells you something, that some people's blood is more valuable in public relations terms than others, which is presumably why the ISIS barbarians murdered 21 of them, hoping to make up in numbers for the fact that none of them were Western Christians. Now ISIS have captured many more Christians from Egypt who were working in Libya, and we must expect the same end for them. The world was briefly fixated by the horrific end of the Jordanian Air Force pilot whose plane had been forced down, who was subjected to gruesome tortures and an even more gruesome death. I could go on for the rest of the show about the wickedness, evil of this ISIS phenomenon, but that won't take us very far. Politics of the last atrocity is exactly what ISIS want. So instead, I want to look at who are ISIS? What are ISIS? Where did they come from? Out of what did they come? How did they become so strong? And how can we stop them getting stronger? For I declare my own position very clearly. I believe that this phenomenon, this takfiri, fanatic savagery, is going to lead the entire Muslim Ummah to perdition. It's already, of course, in Europe. The massacres that we discussed in a previous program in Paris, the other attacks on people in Copenhagen, attending a meeting, standing outside a synagogue, the conflict in Belgium, which led to a firefight of fearsome proportions, and the fact that here in Britain, the security services and the police chiefs and the government are telling us that it's only a matter of time before ISIS tries to mount a similar spectacular here. So who are ISIS is what we're going to be discussing tonight. What are they? Well, who are they is a vexed question. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. Some in the audience will disagree with what I'm about to say. I don't believe that ISIS are Americans in disguise or Israelis in disguise, and I don't believe that either Israel or America created them, although some key allies of Israel and America undoubtedly have played a big role in making this phenomenon as powerful as it is. Neither do I believe that they are being systematically armed or financed by Israel or the United States or Western countries. This is a kind of allergic reaction. It's an allergic reaction to decades, maybe a century, of division and subjugation and failure in the Arab and Muslim world. In the Sykes-Picot era, the Arabs were divided into 23 countries, and we thought that was bad enough. This current phenomenon runs the risk of leaving us not with 23 Arab countries, but with hundreds of Arab emirates, sectarian or tribal in character, and all fighting each other if the West get their way. Because of course, if they're all fighting each other, they'll all have to have armed forces, and that'll be lots of new customers to sell weapons to. But this phenomenon is coming out of the Muslims themselves. I have no truck with those who believe that the Muslims have no agency in anything that happens in the Muslim world, that the Muslims are somehow a piece of Play-Doh that the big powers can come along and manipulate as they see fit. Extremism, sectarianism comes out of the Muslim Ummah. It exists. It's a real thing. It existed long before the emergence of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but the emergence of these kinds of organizations has taken us into an entirely new ballgame. There are people, of course, who have everything to gain from fostering this division, deepening this chasm. But that doesn't mean the chasm didn't exist in the first place. It's also falsely represented quite often by people who have an interest in doing so. It's fostered as, or portrayed as, something that happens between Sunnis and Shiites. But actually, the vast majority of victims of ISIS, of Al-Qaeda, are Sunni Muslims. The vast majority of the soldiers in the Syrian Arab army are Sunni Muslims fighting these extremists. These extremists are ready to and have murdered anybody at all, whatever their religion, whatever their sect. They have and have regularly massacred, tortured, crucified, beheaded, eaten the hearts and lungs and liver of other human beings. It's quite a challenge for everybody. It's quite a challenge for the Muslim world in particular. And we're going to examine in this program, amongst other things, how we can stop them growing any further. How can we stop them becoming ever more powerful? But the Europeans are on alert now, because if they're in Libya on the beach, that means Europe isn't far away. I'm George Galloway. This is Kalima Horra on Al-Miadin television, and the debate starts right after this. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al-Miadin television, coming to you from London. We're discussing the ISIS crisis, and I have an expert audience. At least everyone has a point of view. Mustafa, you're first. Go ahead.
Mustafa Masood, analyst at Ahl Bayt TV. What factors do you think influenced the rise of ISIS? Some analysts have blamed Assad and Iran, while others have blamed the Gulf allies and Western allies in trying to overthrow the Syrian government.
Well, there have been many contributory factors going back 100 years. The Balfour Declaration is a contributory factor to the rise of ISIS, proving as it did that Arab lands, even sacred, holy Arab lands, can be given away at will by foreigners to whomsoever they please. Sykes and Picot 1 year earlier, so almost 100 years ago, next year, in fact, the centenary, when the Arabs were divided after having been fooled by false promises. That's a contributory factor. The total incompetence and failure of the Arab regimes that did come into being as a result of Sykes-Picot and the Balfour Declaration, the corrupt kings and puppet presidents who have presided over absolute misery for most of their people, have not been able to solve any of the major problems being suffered by the people. The maldistribution of wealth in the Arab world is a contributory factor to ISIS. The fact that some small, tiny Persian Gulf countries are the richest countries in the world, whilst 250 to 300 million Arabs largely live lives of poverty and underachievement, is another contributory factor. The failure of Arab nationalism. The Ba'ath Party ruled both Iraq and Syria. Their goal was to unite the Arabs, but they couldn't even unite themselves. If they had, then from the Gulf to the Mediterranean would have been one Arab country, with all the oil and all the people and all the water and all the resources that you could possibly hope for. So the failure of Arab nationalism has, these are all contributory factors, and they have led to a kind of despair which has produced this allergic reaction. Of course, there were pre-existing sectarian fault lines, and I have no doubt that the governments in Damascus and in Baghdad have made many mistakes in handling these sectarian fault lines. And of course, there is the obvious point that it suits the big powers for the Arabs to be underachieving, for the Arabs to be divided and weak. It suits the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and so on, for the only interface with these Arab countries being in the arms bazaar or in the casino when they come to London. It suits them for the Arabs to be ruled by incompetence and failures and venal, corrupt tyrants. Because if you're dealing with a tyranny, you know that the tyrant's going to be there a long time, and you know that no one can countermand the tyrant's decision. So all you have to do is fix one man, make sure that one man is in your pocket, and you have the whole country and all of its resources. So all of these things have contributed to the rise of ISIS. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Because it's unconscionable to me, as someone who believes in Arab unity, for the Arabs to go from 23 states to 223 emirates, because that's the opposite direction in which the Arabs should be traveling. It's unconscionable that the Arabs can be dragged back to prehistoric times, which is the times that ISIS-controlled territories are living in. A man just had his tongue cut out for chewing gum outside the mosque in Iraq, I think it was, just a few days ago. The idea that women, doctors, should be forced to wear in Mosul, a great cosmopolitan city, multi-faith, multi-ethnic, can be forced to wear a double face covering when they're at work as doctors in the hospital, on pain of being beaten or worse by a kind of ISIS mutawa, is completely unconscionable. The idea that people can be crucified and hanged and publicly beheaded with children watching, and all these other horrific killings and punishments. This is a disaster for the Muslims. So what are we going to do about it? That's what we need to explore. Who's next with the microphone?
يقال أو هنالك أخبار مؤكدة أن أمريكا ولأول مرة سوف تزود بعض الدول بطائرات بدون طيار، وهذه أول مرة تحصل. ولبعض الدول اللي تقول أمريكا أنها حليفة للولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، لا نعرف من هذه الدول، لم يصرح عن هذه الدول، ولكن نقول إذا كان هناك اتفاقية أمنية مع العراق، وهذه الاتفاقية الأمنية تحتم على الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية تزويد العراق بالأسلحة وحتى بالطائرات التي تم شراءها من الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، ولم يزود العراق حتى بالأسلحة البسيطة. ألم يكن العراق هو أولى بهذا التسليح سواء كان بالطائرات أو بالأسلحة الاعتيادية، باعتبار أن العراق هو اليوم ساحة معركة حقيقية مع الإرهاب؟ وكما تعلمون أن الإرهاب وصل إلى ثلث الأراضي العراقية وسيطر على عدد من المناطق في العراق، ولكن لم نلاحظ هذا التحرك من قبل الولايات المتحدة بل حتى التحالف الدولي لمواجهة الإرهاب بشكل حقيقي كما نلاحظه اليوم. ولا نعرف لماذا هذا الاندفاع بهذه القوة اليوم من قبل التحالف الدولي على مواجهة الإرهاب بعد أن امتد كما ذكرتم أنتم، انتقل الإرهاب من العراق إلى ليبيا، إلى كوبنهاجن، إلى فرنسا، إلى مناطق أخرى، وممكن أن ينتشر في أماكن أخرى. لماذا هذا التراجع؟ كان ذلك التراجع في بداية الأمر داخل العراق، واليوم نجد هذا الاندفاع بقوة وتحالفات دولية محورية الآن تحصل على مستوى المنطقة.
It's a very good question. Let me deal with the second part first. Not only have the United States not properly armed Iraq, they haven't even delivered some of the weapons, particularly air weapons, that Iraq has already paid for. Because the Zionist lobby in the United States don't want to see Arab countries being armed to that extent, at least not some Arab countries. So there's no doubt that there's a major need for more weapons and especially more air power for the Iraqi armed forces. However, the power and weapons that they had, they proved they were completely incapable of using. Otherwise, how could ISIS, at that time, with an estimated some 15,000 fighters, many of whom were shopkeepers or waiters in Paris, Brussels, London, Copenhagen, before they went to Syria, with no military background at all, 15,000 mainly foreign fighters, swept across Iraq, captured the great city of Mosul, and the Iraqi armed forces ran away, leaving their weapons and their equipment behind them. This shows a real sickness within the Iraqi state and the government and the armed forces themselves. Everybody knows that Iraqi army officers were taking off their uniforms and running away, leaving their men behind them. What could their men do? Either they ran away too, or they surrendered, and when they surrendered, they were ruthlessly butchered in the most horrific way possible. Iraq cannot do this job on its own. So I believe that the Muslim countries, with a balance of Sunni and Shia, have to create a military force on the ground that can retake this ISIS-controlled territory. Amongst the countries that I have identified as being helpful in such a coalition are the Syrian state, the Iraqi state, Iran, Turkey, Indonesia, and Pakistan. A military force, perhaps under the banner of the IOC, with a joint command, agreed like the joint command in the Second World War, is the only way I can see that this territory can be recaptured and the ISIS infestation that they have brought with them extricated. Now, the first part, of your question is, of course, the big one. It's what the Americans call the $64,000 question. William Hague helped to create ISIS, not willingly, not willfully, but by building up these extremists in Syria with so-called non-lethal military aid, by the hundreds of millions of dollars worth of aid that these extremists in Syria were given, almost all of which has ended up in the hands of ISIS. Even if they give it to the so-called moderate opposition, although it was one of the moderates who cut the man's chest open and ate his heart. I asked David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, in Parliament, at Prime Minister's question time, why don't, when he was announcing that Britain was going to help France attack Al-Qaeda in Mali, I asked him, why don't you, for the benefit of the House, explain the differences between Al-Qaeda and Mali that you're going to kill and Al-Qaeda in Syria that you're helping to kill? He had no answer, because there is no answer. So Britain and the United States and all these Western countries and their puppet states in the Persian Gulf have, whether they decided deliberately to do so or not, have built the power of ISIS. I said to William Hague, it was his bad luck to be caught in a lift, an elevator, with me. I said to him, we were going 5 floors, by the way, so I only had about 45 seconds. I said to him, you've been wrong all your life, but you've never been insane. The policy you're following in Syria is actually insane. First of all, you're going to build these people up to such power that they might take power in Damascus. What are you going to do then with Al-Qaeda in power in Damascus? Secondly, what are you going to do when these people all come home with all the training, all the bloodlust that they have generated during their time in Syria? What are you going to do when they turn up in Oxford Street? I'll tell you what you're going to do. You're going to panic, at which point the lift doors open and he ran away. He was panicking already. Who's next?
While I appreciate your talk about the need for military assistance and a unified, maybe Muslim armed response, do you not think at some level we also need to start talking about actual local grievances in these areas? So I'm talking about Syria and Iraq specifically, so the failures of the Maliki government, problems in Syria as well with the civil war. Until these issues are sorted out, there's a reason why certain sectors of the Sunni population are living under ISIS rule, and until that is sorted out, surely we can't really be talking about any sort of solution.
Well, I agree with that, and I've often said so, and I said so by implication earlier. There is no doubt that there are real political grievances in Syria, in Iraq, indeed from Marrakesh to Bahrain, there are political grievances, and they have to be addressed, but they have to be addressed as part of a solution, not as a precondition for a solution. Because if ISIS is not defeated, it will capture more and more territory, it will sprout in more and more places, blood will run like rivers, and the road to disaster will have been entered upon. But you're absolutely correct to identify that the current system in Iraq is not working. The current system in Damascus is not working. And there has to be a political reform that includes all the communities, a national unity government in both these countries, who should, by the way, unite, even if they didn't unite under the Ba'ath Party, which existed to unite them. They are going to have to unite. Syria needs Iraq, and Iraq needs Syria. But that's for the future. The first priority is to destroy this ISIS phenomenon. Now, in the next segment, there'll be time for lots more because maybe I've talked too much. But let me summarize. So far, we're talking about ISIS, the nature of ISIS, how it emerged, who was responsible for it emerging and becoming so quickly so powerful, and above all, how we're going to try and stop it. I have advanced my own program. It's subject to criticism, no doubt. It's subject to amendment, no doubt. But I have carefully identified countries who have military power, who are balanced in a sectarian sense, and who might be, perhaps under the banner of the often derided IOC, be able to contribute forces to help the Iraqi and Syrian armies to defeat their adversaries and take back the territory that has been seized by them. In the next segment, there'll be much more of the audience point of view. This is George Galloway, Kalima Horra, for Al-Mayadeen Television. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al-Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London, discussing the ISIS crisis, an existential crisis that threatens not just the whole of the Muslim world, but is beginning to look like a threat here in Europe and in Great Britain, which seldom regards itself as part of Europe, but undoubtedly is in the firing line, just like mainland Europe, at the hands of the phenomenon that we call ISIS or ISIL. Certainly not the name they give themselves, Islamic State, that being because they're neither Islamic nor a state. I've got a great audience here in London, bursting with things to say. Let's take the young lady in the middle there first, Sophie.
Hi, my name is Sophie and I'm a student. And I would just like to ask if you think the government response so far has been appropriate, specifically in the cases of Jordan and Egypt, where the immediate response has been to wage war. And do you think this is a long-term solution? Is it long-term enough? And if not, what do you think is the appropriate solution?
Well, I'm for war with ISIS. I'm not a pacifist. There are some wars that need to be fought. This is definitely one of them. ISIS cannot be negotiated with because their demands are completely unacceptable. And 7/8 of their demands or 2/8 of their demands are equally unacceptable. So I'm in favor of war with ISIS. The question is, who's going to fight that war? Of course, there are real problems about General Sisi bombing Libya to avenge the deaths of 21 Egyptians when Sisi has killed thousands of Egyptians. That's a real contradiction and a real problem. But I still believe that Egypt had every right to attack ISIS positions in Libya. Jordan undoubtedly was justified in taking military action for the cold-blooded and horrific murder of one of its sons, undoubtedly. But these bombing raids as a kind of, I don't know, thrashing out, a kind of spasmodic, angry response are not going to defeat ISIS. Indeed, it's my view that bombing at all will not defeat ISIS, though of course in certain tactical situations like the one in Kobani in the north of Syria, undoubtedly the bombardment by people who call themselves the Allies did have some military effect. But on this, I differ from the British government and other governments in the so-called international community. I'm not a military man, but I do study military matters. And when I was 15, I was a boy soldier in the Royal Artillery Army Cadet Force. I know something about fighting. I'm certain that a properly equipped and motivated, key word, motivated, military force fighting ISIS would destroy them, and probably very quickly. Because I know the kind of people who are in ISIS. At least I know the foreign elements that are in ISIS. They can be defeated quite quickly, but it needs a significant body of men with the right motivation, the right equipment, and the right plan in order to do so. If I thought, I would instinctively say this should be the Iraqi army and the Syrian army, but neither is capable of defeating this on their own. Of course, they'd be much more capable of doing so if people were not resupplying the extremists through Turkey across the border and making them stronger and more difficult to deal with. So, of course, the first thing that has to happen is that all borders are sealed from ISIS, that nothing reaches them, and they cannot sell oil that they've stolen in Syria and Iraq. Let's take the gentleman there with the glasses.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Mr. Galloway. Bruce Tavasoli, an independent independent researcher. I was just wondering if you think that the current ISIS is actually a creation of Israel and the West, and it is originally a plan to balkanize the region. This was a plan that was originally devised by Obed Yenin in the 1980s, who was an advisor to the Israeli government, and this is an idea that has been picked up upon by Zbigniew Brzezinski. I mean, we know in recent years, as a result of the American Senate Select Committee, that they did the findings looking at the occupation of Iraq, that found that institutions such as Blackwater, private military contractors, were financing resistance fighters at the time. And I was just wondering your personal views on that, the concept of creative chaos that the neoconservatives, of course, devised in America to try and play everybody up against each other and ultimately balkanize member states perceived to be a threat to Israel and America in the Middle East.
No, I don't agree with that, though of course there's much in what you say which is correct. Creative chaos was the policy of the neocons on the Potomac, and they certainly have succeeded in helping to bring it about. It's just that it hasn't turned out to be very creative. You see, these people either never read the novel Frankenstein, or they didn't read it to the end. Because when you create a monster, by the time it's a monster, you're no longer in control of it. That's why it's called a monster. So undoubtedly, this situation is potentially a gain for them, except that the monster is now out of control. But I don't believe for one moment that ISIS was created by Israel or the United States. And it's fanciful, if I may say so, to allege it. Because Baghdadi, or Samarra'i, to give him his actual name, the so-called caliph, self-appointed caliph, is an Iraqi from the city of Samarra'i. He's been in the Islamist movement as a sectarian, takfiri fanatic for many decades. He comes from a long line of such people. After the US-UK invasion of Iraq, the first emergence of what was called at the time Al-Qaeda in Iraq, under the leadership of Jordanian, al-Zarqawi, he similarly had been in takfiri extremist politics for a very long time and came from a long line of such people. The Westerners who've gone there are easily recognizable here in Britain. I know people like them. People like them once took me hostage and threatened to hang me because I was encouraging Muslims to vote, which they say is haram. I know that all the people in that room that took me hostage, 15, 18 of them, with only my daughter standing in front of me to try and protect me, poor she thought that they wouldn't touch her because she was a woman. But of course we know what they do to women, these people. Every one of them, any one of them, could end up in ISIS. Maybe they have, for all I know. These people exist in the Muslim Ummah. There's no point in being in a state of denial. This kind of extremism, fanaticism, takfirism exists in the Ummah, and it's a growing number in the Ummah because of this deep-seated despair, failure, loss of way, loss of direction, and the vested interests of some. Let me give you one. Maybe it won't make it into the show. Saudi Arabia has a vested interest in deepening sectarian hatred. Otherwise, it might fall from power. So they have to seek to divide their own society between Sunni and Shia. They have to try to divide the Arabs as a whole between Sunni and Shia. Otherwise, what's the point of them? Why would you tolerate a corrupt kleptocracy ruling the richest country in the world if it wasn't for the fact that there was a danger at the gate, a sectarian danger at the gate, that everyone must cling to you in order to defend themselves and defend their version of the faith. So there are lots of people with a vested interest in exacerbating this, but that doesn't mean they invented it. Yes, sir, at the back.
Haider Al-Khatib, PhD candidate in international politics. We've heard how the logistical and economic support has helped ISIS in spreading. What about the narrative, the ideological narrative? What role does that play in, and how to combat this narrative?
Well, the narrative springs from the well that a huge number of Muslims are not really Muslims at all. That the world is divided, in any case, between people that they declare to be kuffar, so they're ready to murder Christians who are praying to Jesus, who is a revered prophet in Islam, and whom every Muslim is supposed to be attached with great reverence and affection. You can slaughter this man, even though he's praying to Jesus, because he's kuffar, according to them. Then, leaving aside the so-called kuffar, the narrative is that there are only a small percentage of the Muslims who are actually Muslims. That the Shiites are not Muslims, the Alawiyin are not Muslims, and this Sunni is not a Muslim, that Sunni is not a Muslim, only me and people who think like me are Muslims. That's the narrative. And that's the name or the banner under which they're doing all this slaughtering. Now, as I've said on this show before, don't make the mistake of imagining that the people who rule our countries know anything about any of this. All those terms I just used there, they wouldn't even know what they meant. They couldn't define for you the difference between Sunni and Shia. What does he mean, kuffar? Who are the Alawiyin? They don't know any of these things. They're just happy that the Arabs are divided and weak. It's really a matter of business for them. If the Arabs are divided and weak, the West can steal their things, and has been stealing their things ever since their things started to bubble out of the earth. So that's why the West can support Shiites in one place one day and Sunnis in another place another day. The Shah of Persia, the tyrant, he was a Shia. They had no problem with him. The king of Saudi Arabia, presumably, I say presumably, prays 5 times a day. They have no problem with that. The West has no problem with Islam per se. It's ready, it can live with Islam, no doubt. As all they're concerned about is that that Islam does not produce political results that compromise their strategic and economic interests. So that's the narrative, that's the counter narrative. Unless I've misunderstood you, please say.
The narrative that they used to deploy in terms of the, I mean, we heard that grievances is a, maybe it's a, they can argue is a precursor to radicalization, but the ideological narrative as well in helping recruiting homegrown extremists in the West, and how and the difference as well in the, if it does change in how to recruit in the East as well, does that change the narrative in there? I mean, in here is, I mean, we hear that the Syria or the Muslims are being oppressed and so forth. That can help recruit Western extremists. But what about in the East? How does that come about?
Well, it's a deep question, but of course a profound one. Let's see the kind of narrative that is spun to Muslims in the West. They say that Palestine was stolen. It was stolen by an act of perfidious Albion, Britain, which on behalf of one country gave to a second people the land that belonged to a third people. This crime has not only never been atoned for, but is compounded every day by Britain's support for Israel. They say the Arabs were falsely divided, that Sykes-Picot are entirely arbitrary and false lines on the map to keep the Arabs divided. Well, that's true. And there are many who can relate to that. I mean, you don't have to be Einstein to work it out. They say that the majority, vast majority, of leaders in the Arab world are either corrupt kings or puppet presidents who steal the wealth of their people, who won't distribute it even to their own people, never mind to the other Arabs who surely have a claim to a share of it. They say that these corrupt kings and puppet presidents will never be able to liberate Palestine, will never be able to produce the kind of development which the Arab world so desperately requires. And that's true also. So we're beginning to chalk up a lot of true things. The problem is their answer is the wrong answer. Their answer is worse than the problem. 300 emirates is worse than 23 countries. Baghdadi, the caliph, is worse than the kings and the presidents. They're taking us backwards in the opposite direction. It's the illusion of movement being the same thing as positive change. We'll be back right after this for the next segment of Kalima Horra. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, for Al-Miadin Television, coming to you from London. We're talking about the ISIS crisis, and the audience are just dying to tell me their point of view. Yes, madam. Second from the back. Yes.
My name is Rana, and I want to ask, you said Zionists didn't make ISIS, or they're not using them, but we apparently see that ISIS are fighting everyone except Zionists, especially they're fighting the Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, who are fighting Zionists. So how can you explain this, please?
Well, you're absolutely right. ISIS nor Al-Qaeda have ever thrown as much as a stone at Israel. And that's a deeply suspicious thing. After all, if they're ready to die, if they're ready to give their own lives, some of them drive trucks into schools and blow everyone inside up, including themselves, why are they not fighting to liberate Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem? This is a very big question. And the answer to it, at least up till now, has been that objectively the West and Israel were on the same side as them. Objectively, Israel wants to destroy the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Damascus. The West wants to destroy the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Damascus. So does Al-Qaeda, so does ISIS. So objectively, they're on the same side there. So tactically, why would you take actions that would weaken your position? After all, the West is contributing to the attack on Bashar al-Assad. And so why would you fight the West? Because if the West is successful in weakening Bashar, this strengthens you. Now that paradigm may be beginning to change because of this Frankenstein analogy which I draw. I have no doubt that neither Israel nor the West wants al-Baghdadi to be ruling in Damascus or ruling in Baghdad. I'm sure that they don't. What they want is to use these fanatics to weaken their enemies. The immoral principle that my enemy's enemy is my friend is how we got into this mess in the first place. In the 1980s in Afghanistan, that's exactly the model we followed, which led to the Taliban, which led to Al-Qaeda, bin Laden, and so on. Our enemy was the Soviet Union. These people were also the enemies of the Soviet Union, therefore they are our friend. Well, that's not right. Sometimes your enemy's enemy is worse than your enemy. And by making your enemy's enemy stronger, you are actually producing a giant boomerang that will ultimately harm you. But not only have they not thrown a stone at Israel, Israel is helping them. Israel is bombing the people in the regime forces that are fighting ISIS. And in Quneitra, they killed an Iranian general. They killed Hezbollah fighters who were fighting ISIL. So if you do that, then you are the Air Force for ISIS, aren't you? They are treating injured fighters of ISIS, of al-Nusra Front, of anybody who comes to the occupied Golan and is then treated in their field hospitals and sent back into the battle. Yes, the gentleman there in the middle.
My name is Khalid. I'm a student here. When we look at history, Mr. Galloway, specifically the last 20 years, we notice that the extremist ideologies and the extremist groups are being catalyzed by certain instability in the region. And they get systematically worse in the last 10 years, where we started with Al-Qaeda after US-British intervention in Iraq, and then after the so-called Arab Spring, you have the emergence of ISIL. If we do happen to defeat, and when I say we, I mean the Arab coalition happens to defeat the ISIL in Syria, Libya, and Iraq, the threat will be gone, but the instability will not be removed. So how can we guarantee that history won't repeat itself and that we won't get a group which is worse than ISIL in the future?
Perfectly expressed. I couldn't put it better myself, and that is the central dilemma after we destroy ISIS. But we must destroy ISIS. Even if we cannot yet agree, even if we certainly cannot transform Arab and Muslim society, we can't wait for that, because there'll be no Arab and Muslim society to transform. I go back to the British analogy I gave you earlier. Britain in 1940 was a country that had just emerged from 10 years of massive depression, with millions of unemployed, starving, hungry, with no houses, no books, no schools, no health service, and so on. But you can't say when the enemy is at the gate and about to destroy everything, no, I'm not going to fight until we have transformed the situation in Britain. But you are absolutely correct that if my plan was implemented and worked, would that be the end of the problem? Definitely not. A new ISIS, a new ISIL, new extremism would emerge if you did not deal with the underlying problems. And the underlying problems are Palestine being in the hands of foreigners, an old lady coming out of the Al-Aqsa Mosque just recently was kidnapped by Israeli soldiers, a lady in her 80s, kidnapped by Israeli soldiers and taken away. Palestine is in the hands of foreigners. Foreign interests completely dominate almost all of the Arab world. Almost all of the wealth of the Arabs is being stolen. People are deepening pre-existing sectarian tensions. This pattern of incompetent and corrupt dictatorship. I mean, a dictatorship is never a good thing. But when it's an incompetent and corrupt dictatorship, I mean, that's just a joke. Why should anyone put up with that? And they're not ready to put up with it. So defeating ISIS, to use a phrase I used earlier, is a necessary but not sufficient condition for progress amongst the Arabs. Yes, gentleman at the front.
Hello, Mr. Galloway. Thank you for that opportunity. My name is Hisham. I'm a just member of public. I just was wondering, throughout the history, if we're looking at what they call the Islamic extreme movements, such as like Taliban or Al-Qaeda, it took them years and years and years to build a power, but they still work as individuals under one command. But if we look at ISIS, it's a movement that just came to the light 2 or 3 years ago, and they expanded rapidly with the latest equipment, the latest military equipment and guns, and huge financial support. Do you think there's some specific countries that support them financially, and do you think there's specific countries that work side by side with ISIS? And by I mean side by side, do you think that they support them financially and throughout their military or any other shape or form?
No, I don't. It's a convenient conspiracy theory that I hear all the time. The weapons they have, they stole. They stole them from the warehouses in Syria to which the United States and other countries had delivered them to the so-called moderate Syrian opposition. They simply walked in and took it all. They stole much more from the Iraqi armed forces, who threw it on the ground and ran away. So they're not short of weapons. They're not short of money because, in part, they have looted every bank in every place that they have conquered. From Mosul alone, they took, I think, $300, $400, or $500 million. That's a lot of money when your fighting force is only 15,000 to 25,000 people. But of course, there are people in countries, particularly in the Persian Gulf, who are sending them money. I doubt if the governments of those countries are sending them money, but there certainly have been turning a blind eye to people in their country transferring money and funds to them. But they're not short of money, they're not short of funds, and evidently, so far, they're not short of willingness to fight. Many of them have left quite comfortable lives in other countries to go and live in the western desert of Iraq. Maybe they have some compensations, but I don't think they're there for the money. So it's not just as easy as stopping the supply of money or weapons. The lady behind.
Thank you very much. My name is Yusraf, a journalist from Al-Ittijah TV. What about reports that suggest that coalition planes have actually been dropping arms to ISIS units? I mean, we can't just ignore these reports and say, oh, they happened accidentally, because I'm very sure that they know when it's an ISIS area, they would know that these are ISIS militias, and accidentally dropping, arms is not really convincing. And, should we trust really the coalition for not... I think that ISIS has actually gained more strength when the coalition was created.
Well, look, I'm the last person to suggest that you should believe the so-called alliance or coalition. In fact, I'd say the opposite. Whatever they say, you should disbelieve until you have proved to yourself that what they've said was the truth. So what I'm about to say has nothing to do with my believing them. But in war, accidents not only happen, accidents are the norm. No plan ever survives the first contact with the enemy. Murphy's Law was coined in the Second World War to describe a situation where anything that can go wrong does go wrong. So I see no logic in Western countries bombing ISIS and dropping them weapons. I see no logic in that, so I disregard it. In some of these cases, these weapons were intended for Kurdish fighters in Syria and in Iraq. But there may also be just pure accidents, dropping things in the wrong place. We know that that happens because during the war on Iraq, they slaughtered hundreds of thousands of civilians in markets and in the Amaria shelter in Baghdad and so on. This kind of shock and awe military force is very imprecise. The idea that it's properly targeted down to the last square kilometre, or square metre rather, it belongs in the Newsnight studio fantasies. The lady next to you, please.
Thank you. My name's Huda Said as well. I work as a broadcast journalist for Al-Ittijah TV. You made a comment there saying that you don't think that the coalition is giving a helping hand to the ISIS. So why is it, since this coalition started, we haven't actually seen any impact on the ground? We haven't actually seen ISIS reduce in size or reduce in power. We've actually seen them actually gain more ground as well.
Well, that's precisely the reason why I don't support the coalition. I don't support. I was the voice in the British Parliament against Britain joining the United States and others in bombing Iraq. Britain is not yet bombing Syria, but clearly the government would like to bomb Syria, and I'm against it. I was against Britain and America bombing Iraq in 2003. I cannot be in favour of Britain and America bombing Iraq in 2015. This would be simply illogical. So I'm not here to defend the coalition. I'm against the coalition. There's no doubt that their bombing is not working. Not least because it's actually not that much bombing. The British Air Force has performed one bombing raid per day. One aeroplane, one sortie, one bombing raid per day since they were authorized by Parliament to do it. If you compare it with the Yugoslav war, never mind other wars in the Arab world, it is, as the chief of the US military recently said, of a different order of magnitude. This means it is a fraction of the bombardment that Yugoslavia was subjected to by the very same air forces. So I don't believe that they are seriously bombing. I don't want them to bomb at all. And in any case, bombing is not going to solve this problem. Because bombing only works if you've got a huge army that is assembled as an army. But these are irregular, asymmetrical fighters who look like meld into the population. If an airplane comes across, they just go into somebody's house and hope that that house doesn't get bombed. Or they huddle down with the civilians in the area and are indistinguishable from them. We're discussing here the disaster that has been visited upon the Muslim world with the rise and apparent rise, unstoppable rise so far of a variant of extremism which has set forth rivers of blood, and those rivers of blood may well sweep us all away. More after this. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al-Miadin television, coming to you from London, but discussing the existential crisis of ISIS, the threat ISIS and its ideology poses to us all. Not much time left, lots of people with things to say. Yes, sir, you in the second row.
Yeah, good afternoon, Galloway. Thank you all for your great points. Now, fighting ISIS is the topic I think we're talking about here. Now, to fight ISIS is, like you said it's not going to be difficult, but I think it's going to be very difficult because it will mean more more killings and more blood. But it will take time, yeah, and then we can fight them. However, the situation in the Arab world and how it is being and how the situation now is and how it is, there's a great mess in there. I think it's because of the Arab themselves. Yeah. Now, the former leader of Libya, Muammar al-Gaddafi, he was the idea of behind Arab unity, but they didn't want to listen to him. And now what we see now is a result of not being listened to him. Yeah. So I think is for the Arabs to say themselves like, what is our first priority? Like, first is to get Israel out of Al-Aqsa and Palestine, and then after that we can discuss our differences.
Well, if we wait for Palestine to be liberated before we tackle this phenomenon of extremism and savagery, then we'll be overwhelmed and overcome by that extremism and savagery, because Palestine will not be the first to be liberated. It'll almost certainly be the last to be liberated. So that becomes an excuse for doing nothing. I'm afraid I don't share your analysis that Muammar al-Gaddafi was all the time working for Arab unity. He talked about
Arab unity. He wants Arab unity.
Well, he talked about it, but he didn't actually do anything about it, and he did a lot of things.
But they didn't want to let him.
Well, no, brother, he did a lot of things that actually made the Arabs more disunited. But we're not here to discuss Gaddafi. It's a spectacular achievement of NATO that they have produced a situation in Libya worse than Libya was under al-Gaddafi. On that, at least, we can agree, even if we don't agree on his merits and virtues. Yes.
One more point I want to make is, how do you fight ISIS? Like, who are you fighting against? Like, there's more power behind them, and then you also have Saudi Arabia who's funding them. Now, Saudi Arabia, we know that what they're doing in Saudi is everything against Islam because of how they're treating their own people. Now, how do you fight against that?
I evidently didn't persuade you with what I've been saying for the last hour and a half, because I have been dealing with precisely this point. But as to who we're fighting the armed ISIS elements that control 30% of Iraq and at least 25% of Syria. They are in control of these territories and subjugating, therefore, thereby, millions of people under their control to a life of utter misery and savagery. Now, I don't say that it will be easy to get rid of them. I said if we form a big enough and motivated enough military force, we will easily be able to defeat them. They have no doubt become militarily more powerful, more skillful in the period that they've been fighting. But most of them are not fighters. Most of them are not professional soldiers. And the armies that I adumbrated could easily defeat them. But they have to be put in the field in order to defeat them. And there has to be a unified military command with a unified political strategy if it's going to defeat them. Yes, of course, there will be a lot of killing and a lot of blood. We'll not be able to solve this problem without killing and blood. If we're not serious about fighting them, they're going to win, and they'll be here. And when they're here, you and me and many others in here will lose our lives and probably our heads, because anyone who doesn't agree with them, isn't prepared to live by their rules, will be slaughtered. That's the truth of it. Okay, you sir.
شكرا مستر غالاوي. قلت في إجابتك على سؤالي السابق أنك تحدثت إلى السيد كاميرون حول طريقة تعامله مع الإرهاب في سوريا وفي إحدى الدول الأفريقية، وأعتقد تقصد في أفريقيا تنظيم بوكو حرام في إحدى الدول الأفريقية. وأنا أعتقد هو الإرهاب واحد، بوكو حرام، داعش، القاعدة، النصرة، كلها واحد، والآن يجتاح العالم، ليس فقط في المنطقة العربية وإنما وصل إلى دول غربية. أعتقد أن الإرهاب اليوم يحتاج إلى استراتيجية. سؤالي، هذه الاستراتيجية تحتاج إلى وضوح من بعض الدول العربية أو الغربية. ماذا ترى؟ هل سنشاهد هنالك وضوح من الدول، بالذات الدول العربية التي طالما خاطبتها الحكومة العراقية في قبل سنين وإلى اليوم بتجفيف منابع الإرهاب؟ هناك منظمات، هناك شخصيات تدعم هذه المنظمات الإرهابية. هل سنجد هنالك وضوح من هذه الدول في محاربة الإرهاب بشكل قاطع؟ شكرا.
Of course, Boko Haram in Nigeria, in Borno, one of the northern states of Nigeria, Boko Haram have already declared themselves a part of the caliphate. In Libya now, in a part of the country. In fact, almost all of the country is slaughtering each other, tribal and other militias, factions are slaughtering each other. There's 2 governments, maybe 3 in Libya. Libya is no longer a single country, but one part of it has declared itself a part of the caliphate. Part of Iraq is in the caliphate. Part of Syria is in the caliphate. How long before other places are captured and declared to be part of this caliphate? So it's hard to exaggerate, you know, the danger and problem that this represents. My own mother said to me, for the first time in 45 years, first time, my mother said to me after one of these executions, I don't know how you can be so close to these Muslims. I don't know how you can be with these Muslims. Look at what they do. It's bringing disgrace as well as disaster upon Islam, upon the Muslims, and God knows where it's going to end. Yes, the gentleman at the back hasn't spoken yet.
السلام عليكم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اسمي أسامة. قلت أن لازم نكون حذرين من وصول داعش إلى بريطانيا لأنهم خطر على هذه الدول الأوروبية، ولكن داعش خلق من هذه الدول لأنه يوجد أناس هنا في بريطانيا مثل أنجام تشاودري هو يقوم بإثارة الفتنة الطائفية ما بين المسلمين، وقام بمظاهرات في سنتر لندن والحكومة البريطانية سمحت له بذلك، وقام بضرب ناس نعرفهم في أجور رود والشرطة على منظر أعين الشرطة ولم يقوموا بحماية هذا الشخص. فإذا نحن نجب أن نكون حذرين من داعش للمجيء إلى بريطانيا. داعش خلقت من بريطانيا من دول أوروبا، هم الذين بعثوا هؤلاء الناس إلى دولنا لمحاربتنا تفكيك الدول الإسلامية والعربية. فالأصح أنه لازم احنا ما نكون حذرين هنا في بريطانيا، لازم نكون حذرين في بلادنا وليس في بريطانيا. نحن محميين من داعش في هذه البلدان. هذه نظريتي أنا شخصيا يعني. شكرا.
Britain has contributed to the rise of ISIS and Al-Qaeda in many ways, from Balfour, from Sykes-Picot, from our endless support for every dictatorship or almost every dictatorship that has existed in the Arab world since Sykes-Picot. And there are a few hundred, 400, maybe 500 British-born extremists who are fighting in this theatre that we are describing. But the vast majority are not from Britain. The vast majority are Arabs, actually. But there are substantial contingents of Chechens and others from different parts of the Muslim world. But Britain's culpability in this, I don't deny for 1 second. Yes, sir, the gentleman at the front.
Thank you. Ed Abedian, I'm a student of the Middle Eastern history and politics. Building on that, I wanted to get your thoughts on this phenomenon we have in the Western media of portraying this as a crisis that needs a Western response, as a battle between East and West. Not only what effects does that have abroad, but also closer to home, actually in Britain itself.
Well, it's causing deeper and deeper division inside Britain. An increase in Islamophobia, hatred, fear of Muslims, and a radicalization amongst Muslims. So that's the first reason why it should stop. As for the clash of civilizations, I'm with Mr. Gandhi, who, when asked what he thought of Western civilization, answered, yes, that would be a good idea. The idea that Blair and Bush and Cameron and Obama represent and are fighting for a civilization is nonsense. And if we allow this false dichotomy to march further, we will have a Western invasion, re-invasion of these Arab countries. And as I said earlier, that can only lead to disaster, real bloody disaster. Gentleman here on the end.
Hi, George. My name's Akib. I'm a political analyst. You mentioned a coalition of Muslim or Arab countries to take on ISIS. that's not something the USA or the NATO alliance would countenance, because they've got a massive interest in keeping a military presence in that region. And in some of my research, I've come across the Pentagon officials not being very happy with the fact that Obama withdrew from Iraq or wasn't willing to maintain a military presence over there, especially after the amount of sacrifices and weapons and money they spent over there. So how do you think that would play out? I mean, if there is chances of a coalition getting together of Muslim and Arab countries and taking on ISIS, which is very unlikely at the moment, but if it does happen, how do you think NATO would react to that?
Well, that's one of the reasons for doing it. It's not the main reason for doing it. The main reason for doing it is it's the only military response that could possibly work. The Western military response is not working, and compounding that with a Western invasion on the ground would make every matter worse. But one of the reasons for doing it, whether they like it or not, is precisely to stand up for ourselves, precisely to say, there's a problem here, you've helped to produce it, you cannot solve it, so we're going to solve it. After all, NATO told President Putin, don't dare take Crimea. But President Putin said, sorry, we're taking Crimea, because the people there want to be in Russia. So if you depart from the principle that you can do nothing in the world of which the United States and NATO and so on disapproves, then you'll be a slave forever. And this disastrous vortex that we are in will get more and more painful for us. This has got to be a matter of sovereignty, a matter of independence. Do the Muslims exist as an ummah or not? Or are they mere Play-Doh that can be shaped according to the will of the United States? Yes, sir.
We speaking about the military action like it's the only and 100% the only solution, but we're not talking about, we're using the antibiotic, but we're not taking off the cancer, we're not curing the cancer. And I think the cancer is the ideology, because those youth who go into fight over there, they believe in some ideology, and the West is feeding this ideology with the hate speech and with the double standards, especially with the media, against some specific religious groups, and they treat it like there's blood more valuable than other blood.
Well,
it's just the double standard.
That's true, but I've answered this 3 times in different ways. Let me try a fourth. You cannot wait until you have conquered Islamophobia in Western countries before you fight ISIS. You see, Mosul is very precious to me. Many of my friends are living in Mosul under the occupation of these people. Their tongues are being cut out. Their heads are being cut off. Their children are being murdered in their hundreds. Now, we have to end this. We can't wait for this and wait for that. We have to end this. We have to fight it militarily, on the ground. But of course, in parallel, I'll be arguing about the reforms that are needed in the Arab world, the changes that are needed, and I hope you'll support me. But I'm not ready to wait for them, because there'll be nothing left to reform. There'll be nothing left to change if we don't do this. Mosul is one of the jewels of the Arab world. We lost Jerusalem to foreigners. Then we lost Baghdad to foreigners. Now we have lost Mosul to a different group of foreigners. And they are murdering and destroying everything that they can. Last word to you, go on.
They're saying they are selling the properties there, wherever they are, the ISIS, to Zionists again.
I doubt that, but in a way it's a red herring. They are occupying Mosul. They are subjecting women to rape, forced marriage. They are shooting dead husbands and taking their wives and their daughters. These people are from the Jahiliyyah. This is before Islam, these people. These are not Islamists, they are pre-Islamists. We can't accept this. The Ummah cannot accept it. Never mind Rupert Murdoch and the BBC and so on. We know they are hypocrites. We cannot accept this. If we accept it, we are finished. Nobody will want to know us if we are seen to be in any way quiescent to this. They are raping, pillaging, stealing, destroying, dismembering, executing anybody that they will. And look, if there's no Arab leaders, I'll lead it. If there's no leaders in the IOC, I'll lead it. Let's call a conference. Let's organize a response. I'm ready, even if they are not. This has been George Galloway, Kalima Horra on Al-Miadin. Thank you very much.